afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming to this, which is the first of a series of presentations we're doing, which have the objective for us of increasing the number of research groups coming to us to access LifePath data. So I'm very pleased to see so many of you here today. I'm Louise Parker. I'm currently the principal investigator of LifePath, and my job here is to just sort of set the scene, tell you what LifePath is, and then I'll be moving on to my colleagues who are going to tell you, just as exemplars, some of the work that they are currently doing with LifePath, and then we'll follow up, end up with Jason Hicks, who is going to tell you how you can come and use our data and our biospecimens, how you can use the infrastructure of LifePath to support your research. So LifePath is a cohort study which we've set up across Atlantic Canada, and it's importantly part of the Canadian Partnership for Tomorrow project. The Canadian Partnership for Tomorrow project is Canada's largest health cohort. It includes 300,000 men and women across Canada in the age group around 30 to 74. And it has a longitudinal data capture, so we've done the initial data capture, the initial biospecimen capture, which I'm going to tell you a little bit about in a minute, and we're continuing the process of ongoing data capture. We have an annual or biannual questionnaire which updates us on the information we've already captured and enhances data, other data that we have not yet got. And there is also the opportunity that in the future it may well collect further biological samples. So LifePath is part of this. It comprises about 33,000 men and women across Atlantic Canada who have given us their biological samples, their information, and their permission for us to link with administrative data sets so that we obtain information about ongoing health contacts, ongoing health issues, cancer registrations, and death. CPTP, Canadian Partnership for Tomorrow project, was set up around about 2007. The vision was to provide improve population health, to improve the health of Canadians by understanding better those things which impact on its health, understand the prevalence and causes of chronic disease, and understand the patterns of health care and the outcome from those diseases. There are 5 regional cohorts in CPTP. Across here we have LifePath, which, as I've said, includes people from all 4 Atlantic provinces. We have Cardiovascular in Quebec. In Alberta we have the Alberta Tomorrow project, and in BC we have the BC Generations project. At the moment we don't include Saskatchewan or Manitoba, but Manitoba is about to start their own cohort which will contribute to the 5 sometime this year. Each cohort has a leader. The LifePath, Jason and myself are fulfilling that role at the moment, and then we have other individuals across the 5 cohorts. We work closely together and also separately, so we do things in common. We do the core data that we capture is the same across all 5 cohorts. The core biological samples that we collect are the same across all 5 cohorts, and we therefore have the ability to provide information from either a local regional cohort and biologics or from the whole caboodle. And to do that, we have a national coordinating centre, which currently sits with CPEC, the Canadian Partnership Against Cancer, in Toronto. We also have, obviously with the cohort study, there's other issues. So we have ethical, legal, and social issues, which are directed by Barth and Opfers in Montreal. We have the biobanking oversight, which is done by Anne-Marie Maison, and some of you in the field may know these people in other contexts. And then the data harmonization to make sure that all of our data across those 5 cohorts says the same thing and means the same thing. That's run again out of Montreal by Isabelle Fortier. So across the whole of the cohort, we have 303,000 participants. So remember, 37,000 of those people are here in Atlantic Canada, which has a more straightforward data access process, which Jason is going to tell you about. This is the information that we captured. We captured demographics, so who people are, lifestyle, physical activity, diet, drinking behaviours, eating behaviours, risk factors. So in Atlantic Path in particular, we have occupational history, which enables us to look at occupational exposures, residential history. We have health history, and we have follow-up questionnaires in process. And actually on the desk here is one of our follow-up questionnaires that we're doing in this year, and you're very welcome to take one of these away to get a flavour of the sort of information that we're capturing, bearing in mind that for many people this is the second time they've completed this, which gives us a great opportunity to look at change. And you know, in anything that we look at in medical research, change is the important marker that we need to understand what's happening and how things are influencing changes in health, changes in anthropometry, and change in health status. We have collected across the cohort. We have collected venous samples, blood spots, and saliva. And at Atlantic Path, we have a blood sample on around 30,000 of our 33,000 participants. And all these samples are available for researchers to use. So these samples include DNA, and they also include serum, plasma, red blood cells. In particular, in Atlantic Path, uniquely for the CPTP cohorts, we also captured toenails, and we've measured arsenic and a number of other heavy metals and actually just ordinary metals in those toenail samples to look at environmental exposures. The way we did Atlantic Path was in a number of different ways. One way was to invite people to come to a clinic. And when we came to a clinic, we measured their height, their weight, their waist and hip circumference, their grip strength, and their blood pressure. And then another way that we did it for those people who weren't able to come into our clinics because it was a very expensive way of data capture, we invented the Path Pack, and there is one here. And this was a Path Pack that people would take home. They had the questionnaires on their health, their lifestyle, occupational history, etc. And then we gave them a toenail clipper and a baggie to put their toenails in. And we have the world record, Guinness World Book of Records, world record for toenails. So that's pretty weird, but that's what it is. Yes, one has to take the high points of one's career as they come. And then we also sent them a tape measure and asked them to measure their waist and hip circumference and tell us their height. So we have BMI, we have all of that. So we have a mixture of self-report and measured data for that sort of thing. And we also sent people a little styrette and a bit of filter paper so they could send us back blood spots, the same sort that I collected from new babies, and which can be used as a source of DNA and other stuff as well. So these are the numbers across the whole cohort. So you see that overall there tends to be a surplus of women. All of the cohorts have more women than men because women are generally agree to participate more often than men. That's just the way it is. And you can see that we have across CPTP 145,000 blood samples, and 23,000 of those are in Atlantic Path. And then we also have an additional of 8,000 blood spots. The baseline questionnaire was really quite comprehensive, and it captured many things: demographics, education, medical checkups, So attitude to health services and health behaviours, women's reproductive health, so we asked about menopause, hysterectomy, babies, that sort of thing, personal medical history, use of prescribed medications in last year, and this was some data that we've then coded using the Nova Scotia formulary, which is based on the World Health Organization formulary. So we know every prescribed medicine and every that all of our 30,000 participants have been taking, and it's quite illuminating, and Scott in particular has been doing some work on that. We have individuals in Atlantic Path who are taking up to 13 prescribed medicines, so I think that's a rich area of research which we've only really started to look at. We have family health, that's obviously important for some things. Sleep, we asked people about sleep and physical activity and sedentary behaviour, that whole package of exposures which we believe impact on health and disease risk, possibly through inflammation. We have sun exposure, which is obviously important for health, not only because it increases the risk of melanoma type skin cancers, but it's also important to an important factor in vitamin D metabolism, which is, we're all we Canadians are vitamin D deficient, and that has knock-on effects for our health. We asked about alcohol use, tobacco use, and secondhand smoke exposure. We asked about that. In the current follow-up question, we're also looking at cannabis utilization and other drugs. We asked about physical activity, and as I said, also sedentary behaviour, ethnicity, employment status, and in Atlantic Path, but not in all of the other cohorts, we did a full occupational history. We asked about income, which is obviously a huge health determinant, and as I said before, health, weight, and waist circumference. So we have people across the age range. This is for CPTP, but it's quite similar to Atlantic Path. Basically, what we found is that the biggest group is here. So our 45 to 55-year-olds in particular, women are most represented in the cohort. We've been able to look at the disease as reported at the time of enrollment. And this is although it was recruited on the basis of all comers, it obviously includes a cross-section of the population. So we have around 10% with cancer and diabetes, 20% are hypertensive. We have 1% of the cohort actually had a history of stroke, and then we have other number of serious conditions. So this means that Atlantic Path is potentially an already paid for sampling frame for etiological investigation of almost any disease that you can think of, because the cohort is large. So we have hundreds and thousands of people who've, and these are the numbers for CPTP as a whole, but they're similar for Atlantic Path. So across CPTP and across Atlantic Path, we have hundreds and thousands of people who had extant disease, and then the interval between the first data capture, which started around 2008, and now, which is nearly 10 years, we have incident disease, where disease status has changed. And so it provides a tremendous sampling framework for almost any disease you could think of. And it already provides the people with the disease and the people without the disease who are needed as comparisons. CPTP and Atlantic Path are already supporting a lot of research. This is a couple of examples of a couple of national studies which are going on with CPTP as opposed to the regional studies. So we have a 2 million study which is looking at genetic and environmental factors associated with metabolic phenotype, the metabolic phenotype. So that's an accumulation of obesity, hypertension, dyslipidemia, and diabetes. So that we're looking at that. And then we have another research project, again across all Canada, which is looking at environmental exposures from air in particular and how they relate to health as recorded in Atlantic Path, BC Generations, Alberta Tomorrow Project, Cardiovascular, and the Ontario Health Study. To extend our reach nationally, internationally, the Tomorrow Project is part of a larger consortium which includes all the national studies from other countries, or many of them anyway. It includes Biobank in the UK, which is a similar but though more extensive study to the one we're doing here, EpiHealth, CLSA, Canadian Study of Diet, Health and Lifestyle, which is Stats Canada, etc. So, and the Nurses' Health Study, which is a hugely important study from the United States. So our data harmonization group, run by Isabelle Fortier, works with all of these cohorts and makes sure that we craft our cohort so that the data can be combined with these other studies to make it a hugely important resource for global research. So that's all I want to say, really. I'm just trying to set the scene of Atlantic Path as perhaps a starting point to support your research at the local level, with the potential of moving up to the whole of Canada, and then the potential to move up from that to be doing global studies using data which is already collected, or using data, or influencing data capture in the future, or as I'm sure you'll hear from Jason, we're also able to capture data, images, biological specimens just for you.
All right, thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. So as Louise said, we're going to just give you 3 little teasers, I guess, of some of the work that we've been doing at Atlantic Path, and just give you an idea of how we've been looking at the data, just very high level so far. So we're just starting to touch in on a few things. So when I was first introduced to Atlantic Path, what excited me the most was that there was already an existing cohort of cancer survivors. So my work in where the area field of study that I'm in is looking at physical activity, or the benefits of physical activity for cancer survivors specifically. So here was a ready-made cohort where I was able to come in and connect with thousands of cancer survivors, and the data was already sitting there and waiting for me. So someone who's struggled to recruit cancer survivors to look at some of these different outcomes, here it was available to me right there. So one area that I'm very interested in is looking at the late effects of cancer treatments on cancer survivors. And again, much of this data was readily available through Atlantic Path. So I just want to give you just a very high-level overview of what we've seen in the data. So just as a little bit of background, many of you probably already know that the burden of cancer in Canada and across the globe is great. In the next 15 years or so, we're going to see as much as a 41% increase in the incidence of cancer cases in the country. Now, the large majority of that has to do with our aging population and our growing population. So that's where we're seeing that jump in our numbers. So in the next 15 years, again, along that same timeline, and right now in Canada, we have about 1 in 8 Canadians are over the age of 65. Over the next 15 years, we're going to see that increase in about 1 in every 4 will be over the age of 65. So we're seeing a growing population. We're seeing higher incidence of cancer. So as you can see, this is an enormous burden, and cancer is also the #1 disease-related cause of death in the country as well. So a big issue there. So that's kind of the bad news. The good news is we're getting better at detecting and treating cancer. So with adult cancer specifically, we're seeing about a 60% 5-year survival rate. So that's the good news. Kind of go back to kind of the flip side again. The consequences of cancer treatment and diagnosis, there are some after effects as a result of the treatment. Many of the treatments are highly successful. We are getting better and better at treating cancer. Still have a long way to go, but we are getting better. But there are some consequences or late effects associated with the diagnosis and treatment. So some that some of you may be very familiar with are fatigue, depression, anxiety, these types of things. We also see an increased risk of cancer recurrence, secondary cancers, and other illnesses and diseases as well. So diabetes, osteoarthritis, osteoporosis, functional decline. And an area, again, that I'm very particularly interested in is cardiovascular health. Now, one of the reasons I'm more interested in this is cardiovascular disease, you saw me as I kind of went through it quickly, but on that previous slide, it's our #2 killer. So you put those two together, there's a substantial burden there. So if you look at it with cancer survivors, as many as 50% of cancer survivors, and we have data in prostate, breast, and colorectal dying from the non-related cancer deaths are due to cardiovascular disease. So there's a substantial disease burden here. What we're seeing is our cancer survivors or people with cancer or have a high rate of cardiovascular disease as well. Could be a number of different things going on there. Overlapping or coinciding lifestyle risk factors, smoking, physical inactivity, those types of things. If we look at cancer survivors specifically, we know some of the treatments that these individuals will receive are known to be cardiotoxic. So not only do they have these lifestyle risk factors, they're also receiving treatments that can damage the heart directly. And as we look at the cancer treatment, we know it can be quite intense at times. So your physical activity level, which isn't typically great for Canadians on the whole, will take a hit again. So you're kind of looking at this multiple hit hypothesis, and that was generated from a colleague of mine who's now at Memorial Sloan, saying what is happening to these individuals. So pre-existing lifestyle factors, the effects of treatment, and the deconditioning that's associated with the treatment. So this becomes a big issue for cancer survivors. So you've kind of come through the war, you've kind of been given the green light saying everything with cancer that you're doing well with there, but now all of a sudden you're confronted with these other issues and problems. So this is a major problem, but as we're seeing that the population of cancer survivors grows, long-term survivorship care is becoming an area of priority. So with over 32 million cancer survivors across the globe, dealing with these survivors and working with the survivors to maintain and optimize their quality of life and health for as long as possible is clearly a priority. Now, one area, of course, that I told you that I'm particularly interested in is physical activity. And I say a new contender in cancer care because it's really not a new contender. Physical activity has been around since the beginning of time. We know physical activity can decrease disease risk. And specific to this, we know that decreases cardiovascular disease risk, and we know that can decrease the risk of some cancers as well. It can also reduce the risk of cardiovascular and cancer-related mortality. So looking at physical activity and what role does physical activity play for these individuals in helping them mitigate risk for cancer as well as cardiovascular disease. So just when we're going back to Atlantic Path, looking at these things and wanting to see, well, how many cancer survivors do have cardiovascular disease, or are they at risk for cardiovascular disease? What might be going on there? So using the PATH data, what we did is we had a nested retrospective study, and we explored the association between self-reported prevalence of cardiovascular disease risk factors. So we looked at hypertension and diabetes as risk factors. Cardiovascular disease itself was self-reported as having either heart disease or heart attack or stroke, and prevalence or level of physical activity. So we took a group of cancer survivors and we matched them to a group of age, sex-matched controls, and we took a look at the cardiovascular disease and physical activity history. So what we saw is that cancer survivors were overall 30% more likely to have ever experienced a cardiovascular disease event. They were also significantly more likely to report a cardiovascular disease factor, including hypertension and diabetes. Cancer survivors were less likely to engage in high levels of physical activity. And compared to those who were least active, so for cancer survivors specifically, just looking at that group specifically, cancer survivors who were moderately active had a 35% lower risk of having cardiovascular disease risk factor. So if they were moderately active, which would be considered meeting Canadian physical activity guidelines, had a 35% decreased risk of cardiovascular disease risk or having hypertension or diabetes. Those that were highly active were 45% lower risk. So just to kind of bring it all together, we see that cardiovascular disease morbidity, comorbidity is prevalent in our cancer survivors. Interestingly, what we saw, kind of opposite of what I thought we were going to see, we saw most of these cardiovascular disease, so MI and stroke, pre-cancer diagnosis. I was sort of thinking that we were going to see it on the other side, but we saw that many of our survivors reported having had an MI or a stroke pre-cancer diagnosis. When we're thinking of cancer treatments and implications of that, that of course could pertain into implications on determining what treatments are most suitable for these patients. So is there a cardioprotective benefit associated with physical activity? Maybe. There seems to be some evidence there, and there's other research, of course, that is showing that that's something that we need to look at a little bit closer. And again, dealing with the risk factors associated with cardiovascular disease in these individuals and cancer survivors is an area of priority. With that said, I will invite Scott up to speak to give you another little piece of information on some of the work that he's been doing.
Thank you. So I started back with PATH probably, if memory serves me right, around 2015, and I'm a cardiovascular physiologist that just started working in the area of cancer, very interested in this link between cancer and cardiovascular disease, and had been working with Melanie and we had been talking about PATH and saw this as an excellent opportunity to look at this large data set and start to look at some of the factors that may link possibly cardiovascular disease and cancer. And I had been working with Melanie specifically on the physical activity and cardiac disease and cancer survivors project that she just told you about, along with my other colleagues. And if you remember, the last point that Melanie came up with is how do we protect these individuals from risk factors? So one of the things that, based on my background in pharmacology, that I became interested in was looking at medication usage in terms of this population. And so what I'd like to tell you about in the next 5 or 6 minutes is some of the work that I've started doing with PATH, looking at medication use in the Maritimes. So specifically, this first project that I want to tell you about is specifically looking at cardiovascular polypharmacy in Canada. And this specifically links back to the study that Melanie was telling you about and looking at, how are we reducing these cardiovascular risk factors in cancer survivors. So as you've already heard today, cancer survivors have a significantly increased risk of cardiovascular disease, and this can be attributed to a number of factors in terms of the traditional risk factors that we look at in terms of smoking, obesity, diabetes, hypertension, things like that. But we also know that they have an increased risk as a result of some of the cancer treatments that they undergo because of these cardiotoxic effects that may be seen very shortly after they've been treated or may be seen 10 or 15 years down the road. As you've already seen in the last presentation, when we look at the activity levels, and we know physical activity is kind of, for lack of a better word, the perfect pill in any type of chronic disease, because we know it has benefits for pretty much any different type of chronic disease type. So it would have a benefit in cancer survivors, but what we see is they have low levels of physical activity in comparison to individuals that don't have cancer. So first of all, the level of physical inactivity serves as a risk factor for cardiovascular disease. But in addition to that, they're not getting those protective benefits that may help in terms of their cancer and offsetting some of the effects of their cancer treatments. So we became interested in specifically how is this increased risk of cardiovascular disease addressed in this population. And one of the things that we decided to look at is we decided to look at medication usage. And from a cardiology perspective, are they being prescribed more medications to help deal with these risk factors? So the specific purpose of this was to look at basically cardiovascular medication use in the cancer survivors. So we specifically looked at those with cardiovascular disease and those without cardiovascular disease. For cardiovascular disease, we defined it as individuals that either had a myocardial infarction or a stroke. And we were specifically interested in the number of medications that they were taking. So if they were taking 5 or more medications, we defined that as polypharmacy. And polypharmacy is something else we're interested in. It's been very big in the news probably over the last 6 months to a year. And there's been some more research coming out on it because they show as an individual takes more medications, there's a greater risk of interaction and side effects. So that is something that we're continuing to look at in this population, both within cardiovascular disease and in the PATH data set as a whole. So what we did for this study is we had defined what our population was, and we defined our categories of medications. We then went through with the help of a cardiologist and myself, and we identified using the Nova Scotia formulary and the ATC codes, we identified 23 different drug classes that are associated with the treatment of cardiovascular disease that included such things as anticoagulants, antiarrhythmics, antihypertensives, beta-blocking agents, calcium channel blockers, agents that are used to act on the renin-angiotensin system, things like angiotensin receptor blockers, angiotensin-converting enzyme inhibitors, things like that, and lipid-modifying agents. So if we look at the results from this study, basically what we have here is we have a table, and I've split it into 2 groups. those taking less than 5 medications, and those taking more than, and those taking 5 or more medications. So within each of our control group or our cancer survivor group, we have 2 subgroups. Those that have never had a cardiovascular event, which if you remember is a myocardial infarction or a stroke, and those that had reported cardiovascular disease. And what was really interesting is that when we looked at the data from these 2 groups, and we looked at the medication usage, what we saw looking at the data was realistically the amount of medication being prescribed to each of these groups was very similar. So in both groups we saw that less than 1% of those with no CVD are taking 5 or more medications. But we did see that the rates of polypharmacy in those with CVD increased from 1% up to around 20%, so between approximately 18 and 20% in our 2 groups, controls and cancer survivors respectively. So what was interesting in terms of looking at this study is that we saw that even though there's this increased risk of CVD in the cancer survivors, that realistically, at least from a medication point of view, our data was suggesting that that wasn't necessarily being treated by increased prescriptions, because we saw the same medication usage between the 2 groups. So that could possibly indicate that, you know, the prophylactic therapy in terms of medication usage in trying to reduce CVD risk in this population may not be adequate. So there could be some improvement in terms of prescription and trying to reduce CVD risk. So this was a huge data set, and there was a lot of interesting information that came out of it, and I could easily fill up the rest of today's time slot talking about it. But one of the other things that we looked at coming out of it, or one specific medication that we started to look at, was a lipid-lowering medication, specifically statins. So once again, statins are something that have been in the news quite frequently. And when we look at statins, they specifically lower the levels of LDL cholesterol, which we know are a major risk factor for CVD. And the reason we got interested in this is back when we started to do some of this work in late 2015, early 2016, there was an article published in the Canadian Medical Association Journal, and it was based on the guidelines for statin prescription. And basically the CMAJ guidelines were basically, in order to properly control mortality and morbidity associated with CVD, that basically 25% of Canadians should be prescribed statins. When we look at the actual data from across the country, we see that only about 1 in 10 Canadians is on a statin. So we were kind of interested to see, especially in our populations, how did we stack up against this national average. So here we have the data from that study, and first of all what we're doing is we're looking at it by age group. So we've separated it out into 4 different age groups. And as you can see, and this was really no surprise to us, is that we see that as individuals age, there's an increase in statin usage, which would be expected based on the increase in risk of cardiovascular disease with age. The other thing that was interesting is that we see that the use of statins was much higher in our male participants in the cohort than it was in female participants. And once again, that, you know, considering when we expect the onset of CVD based on age, it's not surprising, and what would be interesting to see if there was another cohort or another age group just past this and we started to look at 70 plus, does that medication usage start to even out at that point in time? When we compare back to the Canadian guidelines, what we actually saw was typically about 1 in 7 participants within Atlantic Canada are taking a statin. So we're still off that average, but we were really close in males. So out of all the males that were in our cohort, we were 1 in 5 in comparison to the recommendations, which is 1 in 4, and in females it was 1 in 9. If we look at it by disease, and the disease part of it was interesting as well. So now basically what we're looking at is individuals that have reported hypertension, myocardial infarction, stroke or diabetes, and we looked at what statin usage was. And as we would expect, if we look at those that have had a history of heart disease in terms of myocardial infarction, we see that statin levels of prescription are quite high, on average about 66%. Whereas what was kind of shocking is when we looked at stroke, that was only about 41%. And we know that statin prescription in terms of stroke can be very beneficial to these individuals in preventing a second stroke. We also saw that the numbers were quite low in terms of hypertension, so 28%, and there's evidence out there to suggest that the prescription of statins to individuals that have hypertension can have an impact in terms of systolic blood pressure. And then in terms of diabetes, we saw that about 45% of the participants were prescribed a statin. Once again, statins have been shown to have a benefit. They're indicated to be prescribed to individuals. I'm forgetting the guideline off the top of my head from the Canadian Diabetic Association. I believe it's over the age of 40. It's recommended that people with type 2 diabetes are prescribed a statin. But the other concern about using statins in diabetics is statins can actually increase levels of plasma glucose, which may have an adverse effect on the condition. So that's why I had the concerns down here in terms of the amount of statins being prescribed for stroke and diabetes. So in summary, we did see that we didn't meet the Canadian guidelines, and there is the possibility, especially from a stroke point of view, that an increase in statin use could be used to decrease CVD risk factors, and then caution in terms of prescribing statins with those with diabetes. So if you're interested in this, at least the work in terms of the statins, there's a brief report published on the PATH website that you can look at that provides more details in the study. The polypharmacy one isn't up yet, but should be up sometime in the summer of 2016, so you can stay tuned to that website for further details. Pardon? It's 2017. I lost a year already. Thank you very much. And with that, I'll pass it over to my colleague, Cindy.
Great. Now, I know we're running a little over, so I'll do my best to be brief for everyone. Like Melanie, thanks Melanie for putting my name in there. I totally forgot to do it myself. Like Melanie, I am very interested in physical activity and cancer, survivorship, quality of life, but today I'm actually going to talk about residential differences in health behaviors. This is a more recent area that I've been interested in, and one of my colleagues at PATH is quite interested in it as well. Something came up as we were looking at active commuting about the urban-rural differences among the Atlantic Canadians. So in general, we know that there are studies in the US, there are studies in Australia, Canada, and the UK that all say rural participants or rural residents tend to be less healthy than urban residents. So they engage in more unhealthy behaviors like smoking and drinking, they have less physical activity, and they're actually more obese. And this was interesting to me as Atlantic Canada, we have more rural residents than the average Canadian average. So if you look at the little graph I have here, the 4 different provinces in the Atlantic region are significantly higher than the large blue line, which is the Canadian average. So about 46% of Atlantic Canada are actually considered rural, versus the 19% of Canada Canada-wide. So because we know that Atlantic Canadians are also less healthy than the rest of Canada, we have a higher rural percentage, I thought perhaps maybe there's something there. So we looked at this relationship to see if it held up with what we would expect. What we found was actually the opposite. So interestingly enough, our rural residents are actually significantly less imbibing in alcohol, they have higher physical activity levels, they have lower obesity levels, and non-significantly, but smoking and chronic diseases are also less. So for whatever reason, they seem to be more healthy. And if we look at this, these measures over on the other side, the actual health behaviors are self-reported. So you could try to explain it away saying that, oh, they're reporting higher activity, and people do tend to do that when they answer these questions. Our physical measures, which were actually measured by clinicians, shows us that the BMI, the percent body fat, and the fat mass index are all better in the rural Canadian or rural Atlantic Canadians as well. So we can't explain that away with self-reported measures. The models that my colleague Michael ran firstly adjusted for age, sex, and province, and then the further models were adjusted for other demographic things as well as the healthy eating index, and within each one smoking was adjusted for within the others, and as we go through that. So really, I mean, this was just kind of shocking for us, and I thought, hey, why not tell everyone else about it? This is pretty interesting. And we didn't look at anything built environment yet. We didn't look at the actual locations if we had them. More specifically, if we can do that. This is just a very cursory kind of look at this, and we found something very interesting, so I think it's something that we can dig into and expand on more. And just as a conclusion, so I don't want to keep everybody too late, because I know Jason has to get up here and tell you all about how you can use all this excellent data. Rural residents, more likely to engage in healthy behaviors than urban residents, unusually. There are lower levels of body adiposity for our rural residents as well. So rural Atlantic Canadians are apparently healthier than urban Atlantic Canadians. So we should all move back to the farm. Yeah. And Jason, I think you're up next.
There we go. Hi, I'm Jason Hicks. I'm currently the IT director at LifePath. And what I'm going to talk to you today about is a little bit about the research platform we've created here, and then also the data access methods for getting your hands on data and also samples. So as Louise mentioned earlier in today, the Canadian Partnership for Tomorrow, CPTP, is comprised of 5 cohorts across Canada, with more to join us in the future. And this is a really good slide to illustrate the 2 methods that you can use to access samples and data. If perhaps maybe your research question was focused on Atlantic Canada, you could approach LifePath to access data and samples directly about those Atlantic Canadians. If, however, you wanted to access information from more than one cohort, you would do so through the CPTP access policy. So, we have a tremendous research platform here. And the foundation of this platform is the participant consent. So participants gave express consent for their information and biological samples to be collected and stored and used for research in Canada and by international researchers as well. And also that this information would be enriched with linked data from provincial administrative health databases, vital statistics, and cancer registries. And what I'd like to tell you now is that this process for accessing health administrative data, vital stats, and also cancer registries is well underway in each of the Atlantic provinces. And in fact, we have cancer incidence cases from Newfoundland residing on the LifePath servers. So that's an exciting development. And this is great information because with the baseline information that we had before, it's a cross-sectional study. But this is where the power of forming these large cohorts and tracking them over time becomes to have great value and great purpose for research. So we're already underway in making that transition from baseline data, cross-sectional data, into the realm of longitudinal data. And this is going to happen for the next 30 years. So this cohort is going to be tracked over the 30-year period of time, and we'll be able to see who develops cancer, who develops other chronic diseases, and using this baseline data, be able to have methods to determine what factors are more important than others. And then finally, the last point here is that they can be recontacted for study updates and also for future research purposes, which is a very important point for collaborative studies in the future. We can go back to groups that you might be of interest to and ask them additional questions or collect additional samples. So now we have the basis, this framework, the participant consent to begin with. What does the platform really look like? And so from coast to coast, for the CPTP, we've got a cohort of about 312,000 people who've completed this baseline questionnaire, and the number grows daily as we harmonize more people and bring more people into this resource. And as Louise described, this is a wealth of data. It's 708 variables that have been harmonized and asked to all participants within this group. In addition, we also have biological samples that have been collected. So venous blood, and the venous blood is processed so that we get serum, plasma, buffy coat, and then also red blood cells collected. And so each cohort has done that as well. And especially in Atlantic Canada, Atlantic Path, we have 23,000 participants who've come into clinics, and we've collected a venous blood sample and processed their samples that are now stored in our biorepository. And we were able to utilize blood spots strategically so that we could add an additional 7,000 participants in Atlantic Canada and more remote regions where we wouldn't be able to get a mobile clinic to them. So effectively, we have a DNA source on 30,000 Atlantic Canadians. And in addition, when they did come to the clinic visits in Atlantic Canada, we were able to put them on a body segmental analysis, a Tanita machine. And this measured their BMI, but also the fat distribution and muscle distribution throughout their body, which is an excellent source of information. And finally, I have to show you as Louisa mentioned this morning, about the Guinness Book of World Record toenail clipping collection, which resides in our biorepository today. And it's an impressive thing to look at. And so not only have we collected this information, but we're adding value to it daily. In particular, we're doing the follow-up questionnaire currently. We're approaching all of our current participants in Atlantic Canada and asking them to complete the follow-up survey. And I'll point you over to the booklet that's over here in the corner that you can pick up on the way, just to get an idea of what sort of variables we're collecting. But in addition to that, we're also adding value to the biological samples that we currently store. So genotyping has been performed on 5,000 participants, from 1,000 from each cohort. And we've used the Affymetrix Axiom array, which measures a staggering 8,000 single nucleotide polymorphisms. So that data has been collected, and it's being cleaned as we speak in the Ontario Institute for Cancer Research. And it's envisioned that over the summer, researchers will be able to access this information to get a flavor of what genotyping data would look like coming out of this cohort. And I also want to note that there is potential funding within Atlantic Path for supporting research that you think might be, would activate the resource that we have. So we're focused on bringing the data sets, bringing the samples to researchers. And if you had an idea that you think that might make this data more available and more samples available for research, then we certainly encourage you to come forward with that information, and we'd share it nationally as well, so that we could make this resource more attractive to researchers in the future. Okay, so now we have what sort of research can be used. We have a platform. How can we utilize it for cancer or a chronic disease research? So researchers that are associated with an academic institution or an institution with REB approval, how can we access this data? What can we do with it? Well, first off, we can just supply you with data. There's lots of data. I have a very large database to select participants from. So perhaps maybe you're interested in Prince Edward Island, with females living in Prince Edward Island who may be 45 to 55 years of age, who maybe consume either 5 or 6 servings of eggs in a week. So we can very easily bring that information to you, and you would give it an idea of what the sample size would be, just so it would help you to give you some basis for a grant application in the future. And then we could also provide you with a letter of intent that this data actually exists that we can provide you with. And I also say with or without linked data. The vision with accessing the administrative health data in the cancer registries and also the vital stats is that we would have this information on the Atlantic Path servers. So we'd be able to link the group of variables that you're interested in within the path data to this administrative health data. And effectively, it's sort of a one-stop shopping. If you consider how the process for accessing, maybe even with multiple provinces with the health administrative data, the timelines are very long. And you wouldn't be able to link the path data along with this administrative health data. So we're hoping to make this so much easier and also advance your research much faster. So there's also samples, of course. So we have lots of samples in the biorepository for use. It's kind of like, you know how when they unveil email addresses and there's sort of like a gold rush where everyone wants to be, I remember like when Apple released their Mac.com email addresses, and so of course there was Steve at Mac.com. You have a gold rush for getting a hold of information. So right now we're really poised to support research. There's an abundance of information. There's abundance of samples to utilize at this moment. And also there's great capacity for collaborative study. I was previously, before coming to Atlantic Path, I was involved with many clinical trials. And patient accrual was always the most difficult part of the study. And this is because you always overestimate the ability with which to collect information from people. And this had a resulting very great difficulty with cost, and then also you have to submit all the amendments to extend your study as well. So just imagine you've got, well, when I looked at the contact database, we've got over 36,000 contacts within Atlantic Canada. Imagine that you could pick them by geographical area, you could select them by whatever criteria you wish to use, and then you can readily invite those people to become involved with your study. And in particular, what I'd maybe like to highlight is that we've already done this with the Canadian Alliance for Healthy Hearts and Healthy Minds. I didn't want to get that wrong. So we've enrolled 883 participants. They've gone through an MRI machine. This was a very significant study, and the fact that when you probably tabulate all the amount of hours that they spent, it's in excess of 4 or 5 hours. So even though we warned them in advance, we still were able to get a significant cohort for this particular study. And finally, what I'd like to sort of draw your attention to here is even though there's 2 mechanisms for accessing this resource, you can either go nationally through the CPTP portal, which if you're interested in information for more than one cohort, you can see the URL is along here at the bottom, and I'll place it up at the last slide just so you can have it. This is really great for looking at the data sets that are currently available. So what is up there is the core questionnaire, or what we call the health and risks data set. It's those 312,000 participants that I noted before. And what you can do here is you can search through the data set and look at different cancers that have been measured. You can look at health history, family history, what sort of variables. And I find this to be a very easy way to search and address a very large data set that occupies 708 variables, as I mentioned before. And coming in the summer, probably, we like to say mid-April, but perhaps at the end of April. There also will join it the biosamples, so that you can look at the wealth of biological samples that have been collected by the CPT cohorts. And then in addition to that, there's also physical measures that will be joining it as well. And so this is a great spot to go and learn more about the data and the samples that are available for your research use. And we understand that this is going to be an iterative process. You'll need to know many different variables to select your group, and so there's going to be lots of back and forth. So whether if you're communicating with Atlantic Path or with the higher level with CPTP, we know that this is going to, we're focused now on supplying this information to researchers in the coming financial year. And so this is our focus to support your research. So we're a resource to be used, and we hope to see you in the future. And let's see. I wanted to, well, conclude with a thank you, but first to sort of point my finger over here at Atlantic Path with Louise Parker, Trevor Dummer, and David Thompson, who's our Executive Director of Operations at Atlantic Path, because it was really their efforts and their fortitude to see this once-in-a-lifetime resource give life. So I'd like to thank them for their efforts. And finally, here's the questions. So you can see if you're interested in accessing information on Atlantic Path, you can contact Ellen Sweeney. Here's her email address. We can load her inbox up as much as you wish. And then nationally, these are the addresses that you would choose to access. Okay? No, we're wide open for questions now.